Children of the Corn by Stephen King. Part 3. Vicky, let me tell you a story. It's about Amos Deegan, who was born Richard Deegan on 4 September 1945. He took the name Amos in 1964. Fine Old Testament name, Amos. One of the minor prophets. Well, Vicky, what happened, don't laugh, is that Dick Deegan and his friends, Billy Renfrew, George Kirk, Roberta Wells, and Eddie Hollis, among others, they got religion, and they killed off their parents. All of them. Isn't that a scream? Shot them in their beds, knifed them in their bathtubs, poisoned their suppers, hung them, or disemboweled them for all I know. Why? The corn. Maybe it was dying. Maybe they got the idea somehow that it was dying because there was too much sinning, not enough sacrifice. They would have done it in the corn, in the rows. And somehow, Vicky, I'm quite sure of this, somehow, they decided that 19 was as old as any of them could live. Richard Amos Deegan, the hero of our little story, had his 19th birthday on 4 September 1964, the date in the book. I think maybe they killed him, sacrificed him in the corn. Isn't that a silly story? But let's look at Rachel Stigman, who was Donna Stigman until 1964. She turned 19 on 21 June, just about a month ago. Moses Richardson was born on 29 July. Just 3 days from today, he'll be 19. Any idea what's going to happen to old Mose on the 29th? I can guess. Bert licked his lips, which felt dry. Oh, one other thing, Vicky. Look at this. We have Job Gilman Clayton, born on 6 September 1964. No other births until 16 June 1965. A gap of 10 months. Know what I think? They killed all the parents. Even the pregnant ones. That's what I think. And one of them got pregnant in October of 1964 and gave birth to Eve. Some 16 or 17-year-old girl. Eve, the first woman. He thumbed back through the book feverishly and found the Eve Tobin entry. Below it, Adam Greenlaw, born July 11, 1965. They'd be just 11 now, he thought, and his flesh began to crawl. And maybe they're out there, someplace. But how could such a thing be kept secret? How could it go on? How, unless the God in question approved? Oh, Jesus, Bert said into the silence. And that was when the T-bird's horn began to blare into the afternoon. One long, continuous blast. Bert jumped from the pulpit and ran down the center aisle. He threw open the outer vestibule door, letting in hot sunshine, dazzling. Vicky was bolt upright behind the steering wheel, both hands plastered on the horn ring, her head swiveling wildly. From all around, the children were coming. Some of them were laughing gaily. They held knives, hatchets, pipes, rocks, hammers. One girl, maybe 8, with beautiful long blonde hair, held a jack-handle. rural weapons, not a gun among them. Bert felt a wild urge to scream out, "Which of you is Adam and Eve? Who are the mothers? Who are the daughters, fathers, sons? Declare if thou hast understanding." They came from the side streets, from the town green, through the gate in the chain-link fence around the school playground a block further east. Some of them glanced indifferently at Bert, standing frozen on the church steps, and some nudged each other and pointed and smiled the sweet smiles of children. The girls were dressed in long brown wool and faded sunbonnets. The boys, like Quaker parsons, were all in black and wore round-crowned, flat-brimmed hats. They streamed across the town square towards the car, across lawns. A few came across the front yard of what had been the Grace Baptist Church until 1964, one or two of them almost close enough to touch. "The shotgun!" Bert yelled. "Vicky, get the shotgun!" But she was frozen in her panic. He could see that from the steps. He doubted if she could ever hear him through the closed windows. They converged on the Thunderbird. The axes and hatchets and chunks of pipe began to rise and fall. "My God, am I seeing this?" he thought frozenly. An arrow of chrome fell off the side of the car. The hood ornament went flying. Knives crawled spirals through the sidewalls of the tires, and the car settled. The horn blared on and on. The windshield and side windows went opaque and cracked under the onslaught. And then the safety glass sprayed inwards, and he could see again. Vicky was crouched back, only one hand on the horn ring now, the other thrown up to protect her face. Eager young hands reached in, fumbling for the lock-unlock button. She beat them away wildly. The horn became intermittent and stopped altogether. The beaten and dented driver's side door was hauled open. They were trying to drag her out, but her hands were wrapped around the steering wheel. Then one of them leaned in, knife in hand, and his paralysis broke, and he plunged down the steps, almost falling, and ran down the flagstone walk towards them. One of them, a boy about 16, with long red hair spilling out from beneath his hat, turned towards him, almost casually, and something flicked through the air. Bert's left arm jerked backwards, and for a moment he had the absurd thought that he had been punched at long distance. Then the pain came, so sharp and sudden that the world went gray. He examined his arm with a stupid sort of wonder. A $1.50 Penzi jackknife was growing out of it like a strange tumor. The sleeve of his J.C. Penney sports shirt was turning red. He looked at it for what seemed like forever, trying to understand how he could have grown a jackknife. Was it possible? When he looked up, the boy with red hair was almost on top of him. He was grinning, confident. "Hey, you bastard," Bert said. His voice was creaking, shocked. "Remand your soul to God, for you will stand before His throne momentarily," the boy with the red hair said, and clawed for Bert's eyes. Bert stepped back, pulled the Penzi out of his arm, and stuck it into the red-haired boy's throat. The gush of blood was immediate, gigantic. Bert was splashed with it. The red-haired boy began to gobble and walk in a large circle. He clawed at the knife, trying to pull it free, and was unable. Bert watched him, jaw hanging agape. None of this was happening. It was a dream. The red-haired boy gobbled and walked. Now his sound was the only one in the hot, early afternoon. The others watched, stunned. This part of it wasn't in the script, Bert thought numbly. Vicky and we were in the script, and the boy in the corn who was trying to run away, but not one of their own. He stared at them savagely, wanting to scream, "How do you like it?" The red-haired boy gave one last weak gobble and sank to his knees. He stared up at Bert for a moment, and then his hands dropped away from the shaft of the knife, and he fell forward. A soft sighing sound from the children gathered around the Thunderbird. They stared at Bert. Bert stared back at them, fascinated. And that was when he noticed that Vicky was gone. "Where is she?" he asked. "Where did you take her?" One of the boys raised a blood-streaked hunting knife towards his throat and made a sawing motion there. He grinned. That was the only answer. From somewhere in back, an older boy's voice, soft, "Get him." The boys began to walk towards him. Bert backed up. They began to walk faster. Bert backed up faster. The shotgun, the goddamn shotgun, out of reach. The sun cut their shadows darkly on the green church lawn, and then he was on the sidewalk. He turned and ran. "Kill him!" someone roared, and they came after him. He ran, but not quite blindly. He skirted the municipal building. No help there. They would corner him like a rat, and ran on up Main Street, which opened out and became the highway again 2 blocks further up. He and Vicky would have been on that road now and away if he had only listened. His loafers slapped against the sidewalk. Ahead of him, he could see a few more business buildings, including the Gatlin ice cream shop and, sure enough, the Bijou Theater. The dust-clotted marquee letters read, "Now showing limited engagement, Elizabeth Taylor, Cleopatra." Beyond the next cross street was a gas station that marked the edge of town. And beyond that, the corn, closing back into the sides of the road, a green tide of corn. Bert ran. He was already out of breath, and the knife wound in his upper arm was beginning to hurt, and he was leaving a trail of blood. As he ran, he yanked his handkerchief from his back pocket and stuck it inside his shirt. He ran. His loafers pounded the cracked cement of the sidewalk. His breath rasped in his throat with more and more heat. His arm began to throb in earnest. Some mordant part of his brain tried to ask if he thought he could run all the way to the next town, if he could run 20 miles of 2-lane blacktop. He ran. Behind him he could hear them, 15 years younger and faster than he was, gaining. Their feet slapped on the pavement. They whooped and shouted back and forth to each other. They're having more fun than a 5-alarm fire, Bert thought disjointedly. They'll talk about it for years. Bert ran. He ran past the gas station marking the edge of town. His breath gasped and roared in his chest. The sidewalk ran out under his feet. And now there was only one thing to do, only one chance to beat them and escape with his life. The houses were gone. The town was gone. The corn had surged in a soft green wave back to the edges of the road. The green sword-like leaves rustled softly. It would be deep in there, deep and cool, shady in the rows of man-high corn. Leaves rustled softly. It would be deep in there, deep and cool, shady in the rows of man-high corn. He ran past a sign that said, "You are now leaving Gatlin, nicest little town in Nebraska, or anywhere else. Drop in anytime." "I'll be sure to do that," Bert thought dimly. He ran past the sign like a sprinter, closing on the tape, and then swerved left, crossing the road, and kicked his loafers away. Then he was in the corn, and it closed behind him and over him like waves of a green sea, taking him in, hiding him. He felt a sudden and wholly unexpected relief sweep him, and at the same moment he got his second wind. His lungs, which had been shallowing up, seemed to unlock and give him more breath. He ran straight down the first row he had entered, head ducked, his broad shoulders swiping the leaves and making them tremble. 20 yards in, he turned right, parallel to the road again, and ran on, keeping low so they wouldn't see his dark head of hair bobbing amid the yellow corn tassels. He doubled back towards the road for a few moments, crossed more rows, and then put his back to the road and hopped randomly from row to row, always delving deeper and deeper into the corn. At last, he collapsed onto his knees and put his forehead against the ground. He could only hear his own taxed breathing, and the thought that played over and over in his mind was, "Thank God I gave up smoking. Thank God I gave up smoking. Thank God." Then he could hear them, yelling back and forth to each other, in some cases bumping into each other. "Hey, this is my row!" And the sound heartened him. They were well away to his left, and they sounded very poorly organized. He took his handkerchief out of his shirt, folded it, and stuck it back in after looking at the wound. The bleeding seemed to have stopped in spite of the workout he had given it. He rested a moment longer, and was suddenly aware that he felt good, physically better than he had in years, excepting the throb of his arm. He felt well exercised, and suddenly, grappling with a clear-cut, no matter how insane, problem after 2 years of trying to cope with the incubotic gremlins that were sucking his marriage dry, it wasn't right that he should feel this way, he told himself. He was in deadly peril of his life, and his wife had been carried off. Well, she might be dead now. He tried to summon up Vicky's face and dispel some of the odd good feeling by doing so, but her face wouldn't come. What came was the red-haired boy with the knife in his throat. He became aware of the corn fragrance in his nose now, all around him. The wind through the tops of the plants made a sound like voices, soothing. Whatever had been done in the name of this corn, it was now his protector. But they were getting closer. Running hunched over, he hurried up the row he was in, crossed over, doubled back, and crossed over more rows. He tried to keep the voices always on his left, but as the afternoon progressed, that became harder to do. The voices had grown faint, and often the rustling sound of the corn obscured them altogether. He would run, listen, run again. The earth was hard-packed, and his stockinged feet left little or no trace. When he stopped much later, the sun was hanging over the fields to his right, red and inflamed, and when he looked at his watch, he saw that it was 7:15. The sun had stained the corn tops a reddish gold, but here the shadows were dark and deep. He cocked his head, listening. With the coming of sunset, the wind had died entirely, and the corn stood still, exhaling its aroma of growth into the warm air. If they were still in the corn, they were either far away or just hunkered down and listening. But Bert didn't think a bunch of kids, even crazy ones, could be quiet for that long. He suspected they had done the most kid-like thing, regardless of the consequences for them. They had given up and gone home. He turned towards the setting sun, which had sunk between the raftered clouds on the horizon, and began to walk. If he cut on a diagonal through the rows, always keeping the setting sun ahead of him, he would be bound to strike Route 17 sooner or later. The ache in his arm had settled into a dull throb that was nearly pleasant, and the good feeling was still with him. He decided that as long as he was here, he would let the good feeling exist in him without guilt. The guilt would return when he had to face the authorities and account for what had happened in Gatlin, but that could wait. He pressed through the corn, thinking he had never felt so keenly aware. 15 minutes later, the sun was only a hemisphere poking over the horizon, and he stopped again, his new awareness clicking into a pattern he didn't like. It was vaguely frightening. He cocked his head. The corn was rustling. Bert had been aware of that for some time, but he had just put it together with something else. The wind was still. How could that be? He looked around warily, half expecting to see the smiling boys in their Quaker coats creeping out of the corn, their knives clutched in their hands. Nothing of the sort. Well, there was still that rustling noise off to the left. He began to walk in that direction, not having to bull through the corn anymore. The row was taking him in the direction he wanted to go naturally. The row ended up ahead. Ended? No, emptied out into some sort of clearing. The rustling was there. He stopped, suddenly afraid. The scent of the corn was strong enough to be cloying. The rows held on to the sun's heat, and he became aware that he was plastered with sweat and chaff and thin spider strands of corn silk. The bugs ought to be crawling all over him, but they weren't. He stood still, staring towards that place where the corn opened out onto what looked like a large circle of bare earth. There were no minges or mosquitoes in here, no black flies or chiggers, what he and Vicky had called drive-in bugs when they had been courting, he thought with sudden and unexpectedly sad nostalgia. And he hadn't seen a single crow. How was that for weird? A corn patch with no crows? In the last of the daylight, he swept his eyes closely over the row of corn to his left, and saw that every leaf and stalk was perfect. which was just not possible. No yellow blight, no tattered leaves, no caterpillar eggs, no burrows, no... His eyes widened. My God, there aren't any weeds. Not a single one. Every foot and a half, the corn plants rose from the earth. There was no witchgrass, jimson, pikeweed, horsehair, or poke salad. Nothing. Bert stared up, eyes wide. The light in the west was fading. The raftered clouds had drawn back together. Below them, the golden light had faded to pink and ochre. It would be dark soon enough. It was time to go down to the clearing in the corn and see what was there. Hadn't that been the plan all along? All the time he had thought he was cutting back to the highway. Hadn't he been being led to this place? Dread in his belly, he went on down to the row and stood at the edge of the clearing. There was enough light for him to see what was here. He couldn't scream. There didn't seem to be enough air left in his lungs. He tottered in on legs like slats of splintery wood. His eyes bulged from his sweaty face. "Vicky," he whispered. "Oh, Vicky, my God." She had been mounted on a crossbar like a hideous trophy, her arms held at the wrists and her legs at the ankles with twists of common barbed wire, 70 cents a yard at any hardware store in Nebraska. Her eyes had been ripped out. The sockets were filled with the moon flax of corn silk. Her jaws were wrenched open in a silent scream, her mouth filled with corn husks. On her left was a skeleton in a moldering surplice. The nude jawbone grinned. The eye socket seemed to stare at Bert jocularly, as if the one-time minister of the Grace Baptist Church was saying, "It's not so bad being sacrificed by pagan devil children in the corn. It's not so bad having your eyes ripped out of your skull, according to the law of Moses. It's not so bad." To the left of the skeleton in the surplice was a second skeleton. This one dressed in a rotting blue uniform. A hat hung over the skull, shading the eyes, and on the peak of the cap was a greenish-tinged badge reading Police Chief. That was when Bert heard it coming. Not the children, but something much larger, moving through the corn and towards the clearing. Not the children, no. The children wouldn't venture into the corn at night. This was the holy place, the place of he who walks behind the rows. Jerkily, Bert turned to flee. The row he had entered the clearing by was gone, closed up. All the rows had closed up. It was coming closer now, and he could hear it pushing through the corn. He could hear it breathing. An ecstasy of superstitious terror seized him. It was coming. The corn on the far side of the clearing had suddenly darkened, as if a gigantic shadow had blotted it out. Coming. He who walks behind the rows. It began to come into the clearing. Bert saw something huge, bulking up to the sky. Something green with terrible red eyes the size of footballs. Something that smelled like dry corn husks years in some dark barn. He began to scream, but he did not scream long. Some time later, a bloated orange harvest moon came up. The children of the corn stood in the clearing at midday, looking at the two crucified skeletons and the two bodies. The bodies were not skeletons yet, but they would be, in time. And here in the heartlands of Nebraska, in the corn, there was nothing but time. Behold, a dream came to me in the night, and the Lord did show all this to me. They all turned to look at Isaac with dread and wonder, even Malachi. Isaac was only 9, but he had been the seer since the corn had taken David a year ago. David had been 19, and he had walked into the corn on his birthday, just as dusk had come drifting down the summer rose. Now, small-faced grave under his round-crowned hat, Isaac continued. And in my dream, the Lord was a shadow that walked behind the rose, and he spoke to me in the words he used to our older brothers years ago. He is much displeased with this sacrifice. They made a sighing, sobbing noise and looked at the surrounding walls of green. And the Lord did say, Have I not given you a place of killing, that you might make a sacrifice there? And have I not shewn you favor? But this man has made a blasphemy within me, and I have completed this sacrifice myself, like the blue man and the false minister who escaped many years ago. The blue man, the false minister, they whispered, and looked at each other uneasily. So now is the age of favor lowered from 19 plantings and harvestings to 18. Isaac went on relentlessly. Yet be fruitful and multiply as the corn multiplies, that my favor may be shewn you and be upon you. Isaac ceased. The eyes turned to Malachi and Joseph, the only two among this party who were 18. There were others back in town, perhaps 20 in all. They waited to hear what Malachi would say. Malachi, who had led the hunt for Japheth, who evermore would be known as Ahaz, cursed of God. Malachi had cut the throat of Ahaz, and had thrown his body out of the corn so the foul body would not pollute it or blight it. I obey the word of God, Malachi whispered. The corn seemed to sigh its approval. In the weeks to come, the girls would make many corncob crucifixes to ward off further evil. And that night, all of those now above the age of favor walked silently into the corn and went to the clearing to gain the continued favor of he who walks behind the rows. Goodbye, Malachi, Ruth called. She waved disconsolately. Her belly was big with Malachi's child, and tears coursed silently down her cheeks. Malachi did not turn. His back was straight. The corn swallowed him. Ruth turned away, still crying. She had conceived a secret hatred for the corn, and sometimes dreamed of walking into it with a torch in each hand when dry September came, and the stalks were dead and explosively combustible. But she also feared it. Out there, in the night, something walked, and it saw everything, even the secrets kept in human hearts. Dusk deepened into night. Around Gatlin, the corn rustled and whispered secretly. It was well pleased.